Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Mound Books. My name is William, and I'm the manager here. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr James Eglinton, who is the Meldrum Senior Lecturer of Reformed Theology at New College, which is the Divinity Department of the University of Edinburgh, and that is literally a stone's throw. It's about 20 seconds walk that way from the shop. So James, it's very great to have you with us this afternoon. We're going to discuss your new book, Bavinck, A Critical Biography. This book has been out for a few weeks now, so some of you may already have this. If you do, please keep listening. There'll be some great stuff discussed here about some of its background, etc. And if you haven't, treat this interview as a sort of little tempter and perhaps taster of what you might be looking for in this book. So I think we'll just jump straight in with our first question, if that's okay.
Sure.
A number of people, as I said, will have already purchased your book and read some of it, or at least probably all of it, we hope. But perhaps not everyone who's read it will know exactly a lot about the person behind the book, yourself. So for our first question, if I may ask, could you just give us a bit of history about yourself, your background, and why you've come to lecture at New College?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Inverness in the Highlands. I spent my formative years in Smith and Culloden Free Church and became a member there when I was 17. So just towards the end of secondary school. After that, I went to Aberdeen and I studied law there. So I was there for 4 years. And after that, I moved to Edinburgh and I studied at the Free Church College, as it was then. Yeah. And when I finished there, I moved to the University of Edinburgh, to New College, to do a PhD, which I did on Herman Bavinck. After that, I moved to the Netherlands and I spent 3 years there as a postdoctoral researcher in Kampen, which is the time in the university where Bavinck spent a couple of decades as a professor. And then at the end of that, I was appointed to a lectureship at New College to teach Reformed theology. So I've been there for the last 7 years and working away quite happily. I'm married and I've got 4 young children, and I'm a member of Cornerstone Free Church here in Edinburgh.
Very good. Just coming off the back of that opening question, actually, why Bavinck? I mean, out of all the myriad of Reformed theologians out there, why are you interested in Bavinck? What drew your attention to him in the first place? Why did you want to study him, lecture on him in particular?
Yes, so when I was a student at the Free Church College, it was just around the time that Bavinck's dogmatics were being translated into English. Okay. So it was all quite new and quite exciting, and the Dutch Reformed tradition wasn't something that I knew a great deal about before that. My own background obviously was within the Free Church, so Scottish Presbyterianism. But when I started to read Dutch theologians, it was just fascinating. It was so close to my own tradition, so much that was recognizable, and yet also different emphases that were really interesting in a very different social context that theology had developed in. So it was really interesting because it was a bit different and a bit new, but also something that I felt I could step into fairly readily from my own theological background. When I was thinking about doing a PhD, I wanted to work on a particular theologian and try and get to grips with that theologian's writings and almost see it as an intellectual formation, a training at the hands of a master from the past. So I wanted the chance to immerse myself in one particular person's writings and really get to grips with the complexity of their thought and try and learn from someone. So I was interested in working on another theologian like that. I didn't want to work on someone who'd published in English because I thought this is a great chance to pick up a new language. I was looking at some figures, John Calvin, who I'd read a lot of, or Martin Luther, but there was already so much that had been written on those kinds of figures, and to begin working on them, you have to spend a lot of time reading other dissertations just to know what's already been done, so that you know if you've got any space to say something new or anything that hasn't been explored before. With Bavinck, it ticked the box of a theologian who wrote in another language, so gave me the chance to learn Dutch, which I was quite attracted by. But also, he's relatively recent. He died in 1921. He was just coming out in English at that point. So there weren't that many people who were working on him anyway, so that meant that I had huge amounts of unexplored terrain, so to speak, in his writing that nobody had written on at all. So I found that aspect of freedom in his work, freedom to explore, really exciting as well. And it meant that I could get into primary sources and spend much longer on them as part of the 3 years of writing the PhD. But he's also just a great theologian. He's Tim Keller calls him the greatest Reformed theologian of the 20th century. I think I agree. He's a really exceptional theologian. So I was drawn for all those reasons. I thoroughly enjoyed reading him from the beginning. And all these years on, I'm still trying to work on him and get to grips with him and learning from him.
Very good. And clearly it's a labour of love. You went to learn Dutch specifically for
Yes.
study Bavinck, is that right?
Yeah.
Fair play.
Yeah.
Fair play. And yes, no, your work has been seminal, your translation works, and of course your new biography. So you are well known for some of your translation of Bavinck's books and his writings in the past. But why do you feel that it's necessary to write a new biography on Bavinck? I've counted at least 4 or 5 that already exist. So why the need for another one?
I think that we need another one, or there would always be another one for Bavinck, because Bavinck was a polymath, so one of the great theologians of the Reformed tradition, and actually just of his century. But also beyond that, he was someone whose life was really rich, richly textured, complex, and engaged. So as well as being a theologian, he was also a member of Parliament for a decade. He was a biographer. He wrote a couple of biographies himself. He was a poet. He was a pioneer in educational theory in his own context and psychology. So he did all of these different things. He was a travel writer, a famed public speaker. He was the pastor of a church. So he really was a polymath, rather than a conventional theologian who did nothing but write obviously theological works. And polymaths tend to attract a lot of biographers because their lives are so rich and so complex, and they attract people who want to try and put all of this together and tell the story of a life that extends in so many directions. So it's not a surprise that there are a number of Bavinck biographies out there already. But why a new one? Well, I think the 2 main Dutch biographies were written. One was written in a hurry after Bavinck died, or as he was dying, and it came out within a year of his death. And it's a really gripping read. It's very entertaining, but it also has lots of problems historically and lots of demonstrably false claims about Bavinck, and has a very particular interpretation of his life that I think is not the right one, especially in his later years. And then the second major Dutch biography came out in the 1960s, and it's a very scholarly work. It's really responsible as a piece of scholarship, but it's also a very Dutch work in terms of the things that it addresses that would be interesting for you as a reader. You know, really getting into the details of Dutch politics. So if you were to translate that into English and give that to an international audience, I'm not sure if it would be the thing that would really grab their attention in the way that it would if you were writing in the Netherlands in the 1960s and that was the world that you were from. And that biography is very focused on Bavinck as a public figure as well, as a politician, as a public intellectual, but it's much more reluctant to talk about Bavinck's own personality or his family life or his life in private, or his friendships with people who weren't big name public intellectuals or politicians, in the way that the first Dutch biography does. So I wanted to try and provide a new biography that's really got to grips with Bavinck the person, you know, that makes a lot of use of his diaries, his unpublished poetry, that tells you the stories of his friends who weren't famous people at all, and weren't in the public eye, but who really meant a lot to him and how his life developed. But I also wanted to try and get to grips with Bavinck as a public figure as well. So I was trying to do what both of the first 2 biographies did, but also write in a way that was quite intentional in being for an international audience and not just the Dutch audience. And I think that there's some other features of the biography that are extensions of why I think we need a new biography. So one of the major features of my biography is the tale of Bavinck's failed romance as a young man. So between the ages of 15 and 31, he really hoped to marry one particular young woman, but couldn't because legally he had to be given her father's permission before they could get married, and her father never would grant permission. But he carried on from 15 to 31 the hope that this would happen. So it's this shadow that's cast over a very important part of his life, where he was unhappily single and really struggled with it, and had hopes for the future with this prospective marriage that was never to be. And that story has never been told by previous biographers. I think because the biographers, well, maybe didn't feel the freedom to tell the story when, for example, the woman he did eventually marry was still alive. She outlived him for quite some way, and his daughter lived well into the 20th century. You'd have to be pretty bold as a biographer to go through his diaries and say that actually there are 15, 16 years of Latin notes about someone else who he first hoped to marry. But I think it's so consequential for Bavinck's own story, because the singleness is the thing that he then channels towards bookishness and writing and reading the volumes of literature that he had to read to produce his own theology. And the thing that enabled him to do that was unexpected singleness and loneliness. So I think telling that story is actually really important, and being able to explain why he produced the Reformed dogmatics and why he had the time to do so. But it's not in the previous biographies. But I think I have a bit more liberty to tell that story because I'm not Dutch, I'm not from his denomination. The immediate family line of descent is just a few degrees on, so you do have a bit more freedom as a biographer a century on that you don't have immediately after he dies, or even a few decades after he dies. So I think the time is really ripe for a new biography.
Okay, very good. You talked there about the original biographies, etc., being in very much a Dutch context. Did you find it straightforward or simple? Easy is not quite the right word, but maybe straightforward. Did you find it straightforward enough to be able to take it out of that Dutch context and put it into more British or even American sort of context?
Yes, and I think the challenge of doing that actually helps shed a lot of light on Bavinck and on why he's interesting and relevant in many ways today. You can't tell his life story without setting it in its original Dutch context. And but that context is really fascinating. And the first 2 chapters of the biography are context-setting chapters. And so there's a chapter there on the denomination that he came from, which was a denomination that had seceded from the established mainstream Dutch Reformed Church in 1834 over issues around freedom of religion. Should the government tell you what you have to sing on Sundays? Those kinds of questions. And the government at that point tried really hard to exert control over the church and funded its ministers and tried to regulate their theology. And the Netherlands wasn't a democracy then. So the church that seceded then was persecuted by the state in all kinds of dramatic ways. Church services were illegal, so you had to hold them in secret in barns or in fields or in forests. They would regularly be broken up by the police. The pastors would be assaulted, imprisoned, fined. So the church life was clandestine. And they would have soldiers stationed in their homes by the government to be disorderly and to spoil your family life. And you would be billed for their wages for the time that they were with you. So the church that he came from has a really fascinating story around questions about liberal democracy, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, the relationship of the church to the state. So if you don't know that context, it's really hard to make sense of Herman Bavinck's life or his theology. But that all changed just before he was born, and the Netherlands became a democracy. But that was something that was very new to his parents, who'd known persecution. So the question for them is, how do we raise our children in this new free social context that we have? So there's a chapter that tries to set that out and then set the context in his family, with how his parents understood their new social context and how they tried to parent as Christian parents in a brand new setting like liberal democracy. All of a sudden you're free to think whatever you want. And if that's new, you haven't grown up with that, what do you do with it? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? How do you disciple Christian kids in that kind of a context? So there's not that much in English on any of those things if you wanted to read about it. So it was really great to have the chance in the biography to share the story of that church in the first place with the rest of the world in English, and also to tell the story of his parents as well. But then the focus does shift quite a bit towards the end of the biography on a more international Herman Bavinck, because he has a lot of friends who emigrate to North America because of the persecution. So he corresponds with them a lot over his lifetime, and he's really interested in America in the first place, and what it's like to be a Christian there as opposed to in the Netherlands. So he's quite international in outlook anyway, and has a lot of questions about culture in different places and how to think as a Christian about cultural differences. He's also very interested in Scotland as well, Free Church of Scotland. He was interested in New College, because at that point that was established by the Free Church, which is really the Scottish equivalent to his denomination. And New College was established to be the first faculty of a new Free Church university, with the ambition that they would add all kinds of other departments to the theological department. And its history obviously developed differently, and then it became the Free Church College, or New College, which became part of the University of Edinburgh. But he was very interested in this from the beginning, and what's happening in Edinburgh, and had plans to come and visit the Free Church College, although they never materialised. But then he does become very international later in life, or in his early life as well. He travels to America and has all kinds of fascinating things to say about Christianity between cultures. And then he went to America again later in life, and then became quite a prominent critic of racism in America. And so the story becomes quite international anyway. He becomes very concerned with the international missions movements, and with trying to promote missiology within theological training to help Christians think about what they do with the gospel between their own culture and other cultures. And so international missions become very, very important to him, and that's also largely unknown about Herman Bavinck. So I've tried to bring that out in the biography as well. So the story becomes more and more international, I think, as you go through the chapters, just because the world changes, and the steam engine means that you can go back and forth across the Atlantic in what would have seemed an unimaginably short time to his grandparents. There's a lovely quote in a newspaper about his trip to America, that his first trip to America, that it had taken a matter of weeks to sail there and travel around and then get back. And the lovely quote says that you can go to America in a hop and a skip these days. We would think of sailing across the Atlantic over a week as a really long journey, because you can fly across it in 6 or 7 hours from Western Europe. But in their day, a week to get to North America was just incredibly quick.
Yeah, well, you mentioned there the first few chapters setting out the background and context, which is something that perhaps most people living at least in Scotland would not be aware of about Bavinck. But for yourself, when you were doing the research for this book, is there anything that you discovered that you weren't aware of? No, you've done obviously a lot more research on this than the average person might have done, so you knew a lot going into it. But is there anything in particular which surprised you or came as unexpected about his life, which you didn't know about before you researched the book?
Well, certainly the story about Amelia, this woman that he hoped to marry. So I discovered her fairly early on the second or third page of his teenage diary when I started to read it. There were these notes in Latin about Amelia Deccaranum. His real Dutch name was Amelia den Decker, and he writes about her in Latin exclusively, I think as a secret code, because it's his private romantic aspirations. And was interested to discover that the teenage Bavinck was really besotted with this young woman who was a few years older than he was as well. And to discover that actually she plays such a prominent role over a decade and a half of his young life, even to the extent that we need to know her story to understand the circumstances of his most important theological works and giving him time to write them. That was really fascinating to discover that this isn't mentioned in previous biographies. Well, there's one Dutch biography that mentions very obliquely in passing that his young diaries show that that he was a young man who appreciated the opposite sex or something like that. But it doesn't go into any detail at all, as though maybe he once wrote a romantic poem or something like that. I found a really epic marriage proposal poem that he'd written for Amelia. So that whole story is really sad, actually. It's beautiful in its own way, but very sad, because of how much detail he goes into in his diaries about his attempts to convince her father to give permission, and he never ever would. And how much he builds his early life around trying to become impressive enough to convince the father to say yes. Is really profound and sad. So that was fascinating, just because of how important it is for his life story, and that's not in the previous biographies. So I wouldn't have known about it if I'd only read the other biographies or reading the sources. Uncovered a really powerful story. I think how much his thinking developed later in life as well was also something that I hadn't appreciated before I did this work. But so in his early life, he was a noted public apologist for Calvinism, and remained that throughout his life. But in his last couple of decades, he added to that a role as a public defender of Christianity more generally, not at the expense of defending Calvinism, but alongside it. And I hadn't appreciated that carefully enough before I did the work on the book. But it's also a really significant thing to try and learn from, I think. So Bavinck moved to defend Christianity as well as Calvinism in the last couple of decades of his life. So in the early 1900s up until his death in 1921, because Christianity itself, much more basically, had come under attack, as though the whole thing was unviable. Never mind kind of squabbling or infighting within Christianity between different denominations or traditions. Secularization had begun in a really profound way that was trying to cut down the tree at the very base of the trunk rather than just chopping up branches here and there. So he realized that he couldn't just defend Calvinism. He had to keep on defending it, but he had to start finding new ways to be an apologist for Christianity in a more general sense as well. And I think the kind of social conditions that we live in are still, they'd be very recognizable to him and his rationale for defenders of particular traditions within Christianity. They also need to have an accent that highlights the Christian faith in a more general sense as well. Because I guess for Bavinck, he saw that really it's about faith over against unbelief in the first place, and if you don't tackle that, then your attempts to be an advocate for, an apologist for, whatever your theological tradition is, someone's already cut them off long before you ever get to make the argument. So that's a really significant shift in his thinking in the last couple of decades of his life that I hadn't appreciated well enough before, but I found him really fascinating to try and engage with and see how much that shapes his life actually for the last couple of decades.
Yeah. So would you agree then that your biography is not just simply retelling his story, but rather talks about the development of his own theology then as well?
I've tried to do that without getting really bogged down in the details in a way that would slow down the narrative of the life story. So a biography needs to move from page to page and carry the reader along in what is inherently a really interesting life story. But I have tried to use it to give people some sense of how his thought develops and why he wrote particular books at certain times. And I think if you, it's the way I've tried to think about Bavinck for the biography is to have a bird's eye view, but that at the same time lets the works speak for themselves as they develop. So tried not to approach him in the first place with thinking, okay, I know exactly which categories he fits in and how I'm going to interpret it, or use these as a lens to interpret it. Actually, I've tried to let the works speak for themselves as they develop, maybe more organically over his lifetime. But I hope that it is helpful for people who want to then go on and read some of his own works, that they can make much more sense of them, because I've tried to set out which phase in his life he wrote particular books in, which questions he was trying to address, why he wrote those books in the first place, whether he was happy with them after a few years, or whether he revised his opinions or wrote something else instead.
That's very helpful. But just trying to sort of two final questions then, perhaps a bit more practically. Who would you consider the primary audience of your book to be? I mean, did you write it for seminary students, for example, or did you write it just for people who like a good story?
I've tried to write it fairly intentionally for multiple audiences and kinds of reader. I think if you're already interested in Bavinck, then you're an obvious person who should probably think about reading it, because I think it will really help you with understanding his works and his thoughts and setting them in a context, which is really important in working out, can you use these works in your own context? So if you're into Bavinck already, then I'm trying to write for you and help you with making sense of him. But I think in a far broader sense, for Christians in general, biography is a very useful genre of literature to read. It's quite deliberately a critical biography rather than a commemorative biography. So it's not hagiography. It's critical in the sense of me using sources, primary sources, to try and tell his story and saying what the sources will allow me to say in a way that's a kind of warts and all biography. So it's an honest biography, and I'm not trying to airbrush out things that are unflattering. I'm also not just trying to destroy his reputation I'm trying to be really fair with what actually happened in his life, and accurate. And so that's a useful thing anyway. I think it's more useful than hagiographical, biographical writing, which does tend to Photoshop the subject quite extensively and isn't interested in things that might not show the person in a constantly flattering light. But if it's that kind of approach to a biography of someone who was a really remarkable Christian, then I hope anyway that the biography is instructive and stimulating in the way that I always look for in other biographies. I want them to help me think with this person about what it means to be a Christian and how to do that in your own particular calling in life, in terms of where and when you were born, where you come from. No theologian or no Christian lives nowhere in a vacuum. No theology is written in a vacuum or written to a vacuum.
Yeah.
It's all in a real world context. And as if for Christian readers, if you want to follow Christ well in your own particular context, it's really helpful to have access to the lives of people who've done that remarkably and who are very self-conscious of their own context as well. So Bavinck provides that, and does so in a really remarkably holistic way. And that's something that drew me to his life story and made me think I need to write this story not just for Bavinck specialists, but to make it available and accessible to ordinary people as well, because his life has such a strikingly holistic character as a Christian, and that's something that we really need. So Bavinck was really marked in his life by the belief that Christ's Lordship extends to all of life, and that Christians should aim to live before the face of God in an intentionally Christian way in each area of their lives. So Christianity is not just something for what you do in church on Sunday or some private moments of your day, when you take time to pray or read the Bible. Those things are profoundly important to Christianity, but Christianity is a life and worldview, Bavinck would call it. It's something that extends to sanctify and redeem every part of your life, your professional life, your family life, how you think about the society you live in, art, science. So the gospel is good news for everything. And Bavinck's life is remarkable to the degree that he tried to pursue that, tried to think and live Christianly across all of these different fields in society and all the different things he did with his life as well. So he had a remarkably anti-secular life and everything that he tried to be. And that's something that is tremendously beneficial to read and to have access to. So I hope that the people who read it are not just the Bavinck super fans, but people who just like to spend some time thinking about what a life in the modern age could look like when it's lived in an intentionally Christian way in every part of that life. You can learn a lot from that. I certainly have from reading Bavinck.
Well, thank you very much. So just in closing then, I mean, you've already sort of touched on this a wee bit, but what would you say to someone who's considering buying your book, who hasn't just stepped over the line to buy it just yet? So what would you do to encourage or recommend that they'll go ahead and buy it and read it for themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I probably touched on some of that in the last answer there, that I think Bavinck is a tremendously helpful person to get to know. He's someone who will help you think more clearly about scripture, about the character of the Christian life, and I think about how to live holistically before the face of God, particularly in a secular modern context. The world that Bavinck lived in was essentially a younger version of the one that we do, but substantially very similar and recognizable. And the things that he struggled with are still struggles that Christians have today. But I think a lot of the time we're not really aware of those struggles. And there I'm speaking specifically about how secularized Christians today allow the gospel to become. And secularized in the sense of it addresses some parts of your life, but not all of it. And I think a huge need that particularly evangelical Christians have today is of sources that will help them to see just how large and capacious the gospel is, how it really does address all of life, and it's good news for the whole world, and it's good news for the whole of your life, and not just for segments of it. We don't have enough people who help us see that. But once you do see that, and Bavinck is a great help in seeing what a life before the face of God could look like, and where your whole life is holistic all of a sudden rather than very fragmented. That's a really compelling and attractive thing. It cannot be unseen, and I wouldn't want to unsee it. I think Bavinck has helped me so much as a Christian to realise just how the Christian faith is truly a faith for all of life. And it's a very countercultural thing in the kind of world that we live in, where faith is a very private thing. Bavinck will help you see that your faith can truly enrich all of life. And the biography is a great place to start with, getting that not just from his own writings, but from a perspective on the life that formed those writings, and the life that was also informed by what he was writing as well.
Well, I just can't think of a better recommendation than that from the author himself. So that really brings our interview to a conclusion this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr Eglinton.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely to talk.
No problem at all. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for joining us and watching this interview with Dr James Eglinton on his new book, Bavinck, A Critical Biography. This book is now available at Mound Books. Visit us at our website, www.moundbooks.com, or come into the shop in central Edinburgh and visit us for yourself. The RRP, that is the recommended retail price for this book, is $34.99, but we have it at the exclusive price of $24.50. Again, this is available at our physical shop and also on our website. We are open from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m, but please check our Instagram and Facebook pages for our Christmas opening hours, as we have extended them a wee bit in the week leading up to Christmas. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you soon for some more exclusive interviews.